Hi, thanks for coming. So my name is Emily, and I'm the Director of User Experience for R&D at Hobson's. And what that really means is that I head up the UX efforts for a small team within a larger ed tech company, and we're focused just primarily on innovation. So what I was asked to come talk about today is just what exactly is UX. So I'm going to cover two different things. One is kind of the philosophy and background of what user experience is all about and kind of how it came to be what it is at the moment. And then the other thing I'll talk about is just some specific techniques and tools that you can try in your own business if you want to get some of the insights that we're seeing from doing user-centered design work. So first of all, what is user experience? It seems like that should be an easy question, but it's really not. When I look at UX job listings online, they are all over the map. Some of them ask for JavaScript programmers. Some of them expect you to have a master's degree in human factors so you can do psychology and then user research. Some expect interaction design skills. There's really a very broad and nebulous definition of what UX is at the moment. So that's, I think, part of the reason why it's not clear to people what it's really all about. To me, what UX is a way of developing empathy by fully understanding your users so that then you can identify what problems matter to them and solve those problems in a really meaningful way. So someone popped in a hatch a few minutes ago and was talking about, oh, I could use UX because our website needs help. We can definitely use these techniques to help improve a website, but it's a lot more than that. In the role that I'm in right now, UX is really critical for strategy, business strategy. And I do a lot of different things, ranging from research to prototyping, testing, iterating, all of those sorts of things to help narrow in on a problem that's worth solving and then figure out the best way to solve it. And I also do a lot of storytelling. And what I mean by that is just finding ways to communicate who the user is and what they need and articulate that in a way so that other people will get on board about what problems you need to be solving. So, a couple of things I wanted to just mention. The Lean Startup. Have any of you guys read The Lean Startup? One yes, one no. A couple others. We've got a mixed room in here. Lean Startup is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I recommend you go out and get it right away. It has all kinds of great case studies that talk about how to test an idea in the lowest impact possible way so that you're not wasting time and efforts trying to solve the wrong problems. And design thinking is a methodology that's been around for a long time. It's actually what designers have sort of always done when they approach problems. It was Tim Brown at IDEO that put a structure around it, which I'm sure you probably can't read the slides if you're watching online, but it's just empathize, define, iterate, prototype, and test. Or sorry, ideate, prototype, and test. And that goes hand in hand with the Lean Startup. You're saying you need to understand your customers, and then you need to come up with some ideas that might help them, and then test and adapt as you go to make sure that you're really doing the best possible thing for them. So put those things together, and what you have is called Lean UX. There's a book by Jeff Gothelf that actually took the principles from Lean Startup and from design thinking and meshed them together. But really, Lean UX, in my opinion, is just good UX. It's what UX designers, especially in software companies, have been doing for a really long time. But Jeff did a great job of kind of articulating what it really means, what it looks like. But to me, this is just UX, which is, again, empathizing with your users and then finding lightweight, low-tech ways to test your ideas. You want to do things face-to-face. You want to have it feel personal because you're empathizing with those people. You're understanding their issues. And you also want it to move quickly and be focused on outcomes. So when I train teams on what design thinking or Lean UX, there's a lot of buzzwords, right? Lean UX, Lean Startup, design thinking, all these different terms. If you don't understand the differences between them, that's fine. At the core, they share that same goal of finding empathy and then solving meaningful problems. So when I'm training teams on how do you do this, there is an actual step-by-step approach that I use that works on any project for any business. It doesn't matter if you're a startup, if you're an existing business, if you're service-based, if you're a technology company, it doesn't matter because this is a thought process that you need to go through to get successful outcomes. For today, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I'm going to break this, what I call my sea monster map, into 3 bigger phases and just talk briefly about some things you can do to accomplish each of those. But before I get into that, I want to talk about why UX is important. The main reason why UX is important is because most ventures fail when they build something that nobody wants. That seems obvious, but a lot of companies still do it. They build a solution to a problem that people don't care about. So UX is really useful because it helps you learn whether people want your idea, if so, how they want it to work. And along the way, you make sure that you're solving the right problem and you're minimizing risk. So I'm just going to back up 2 slides really quick because I want to mention what this is generally referred to more broadly is the discovery process. You're discovering what you're going to build before you build it. So UX really helps with that. Now I'm going to give you a real-world example of where UX/design thinking can really make a difference. A group of Stanford students about, I guess it was 8 years ago now, were asked to solve this problem or find a way to help with this problem of premature infant deaths in developing countries. So their first instinct was to develop incubators at a much lower cost so that the hospitals in developing nations could have access to these incubators, could have the equipment on hand. So it seems like a good solution, right? But what actually happened then was the students visited a village in Nepal and talked to the mothers, prospective users of their product. And pretty quickly they found out that the environment was just very different than anything they had imagined. The mothers don't give birth in hospitals. They can't even get to the hospitals because they're in such remote areas. So this incubator is a solution to a problem that the users didn't care about. It was just not something that was relevant at all. So the students reframed the problem, and what they came up with was called the Infant Embrace Warmer, which is essentially a sleeping bag for infants, but it has this wax-like substance inside that keeps their body temperatures where they should be. So it is basically an incubator, but it's one that can be used in the villages. It doesn't require travel to the hospital. This is solving the right problem. And they never would have known what the right problem was had they not done that user research and found out who their customers really were, what their lives were like, and what they needed. So it's all about changing your perspective, right? And one thing that's really important to focus on is shifting from producing stuff to learning stuff. I think that's really the key mindset you need to adapt if you're going to do this kind of work. And I'll give you an example. So this is the company that I work at. The big green circle is the company, the mothership. And all of these purple circles around it represent individual product teams that are producing lots of stuff. So all these orange dots are features or products or things that each one of those teams did over the course of a year. If you're a CEO and you look at this, you immediately see a huge problem, right? What is going on with that team on the bottom right? They're not doing anything. Well, that, of course, is my team. And what's going on there is instead of just cranking out code and trying to maintain the status quo and keep everybody really busy, we decided to do an experiment where we would spend a year learning as much as we possibly could about our customers and what they needed. We would try to find some kind of solution that they'd never had before that would be really meaningful to them. And the outcome of that was our team produced one product that generated $8.5 million in revenue for that company in 12 months. This is a $120 million company, so that's pretty significant. All those other teams that were really busy all year, they kept the product running. You know, they did important work, but none of them significantly contributed to the revenue of the company. So now if you're the CEO, we look pretty good. That's actually why I still have a job, fortunately, because that experiment worked. But we've changed our focus from producing to learning. Another way of saying that is we're not focused on output, you want to focus on the outcome. What's the result that you can achieve by taking the time to get to know your customers and do user-centered design work? And something that's kind of fun about this is that once you adopt this mindset, then every experiment that you try is a success. Even if you have an idea that completely tanks, it's still successful because you learned that was a bad idea. So I think it's kind of liberating once you get this mindset going, just to realize that you're always learning something and you can immediately take that and fold it into the next iteration of what you're doing and it'll be more successful as a result. So that's the background, what UX is and why I think it's important. And now I just want to talk a little bit about some specific techniques that you can try in your own business. Now obviously on this whole big map there are dozens if not hundreds of different things I could tell you to do, but I don't want to overwhelm you. So I've picked a couple that might seem kind of basic, but they're basic because they're kind of fundamentals. They're UX fundamentals, and if you do these, if you apply these to your business, you will gain some insights that you can use. So first of all, I'm going to break this into three main topics: getting to know your customers, telling a clear story, and then testing early and often. So for getting to know your customers, I kind of already gave you an example with the women in Nepal, going out and observing them, and I really just can't stress how important it is to get out of the building and watch people using your product. I've got a couple pictures here. One, we had built some prototypes for grade school kids, and I took them straight to a museum and watched kindergartners use them. Because you don't want to just get reports back from a teacher or a parent that the kid liked it. You want to see them in their own environment, see what manual dexterity issues they might have clicking on certain UI components you've designed, see what vocabulary they're not familiar with that they have to ask their parent to define for them. You don't see that stuff if you're not sitting there watching them use it. And then I have another picture here of some high school, inner city high school kids. I will actually go into a setting like that and work with them and have them help co-design whatever the software is, because you want to make sure that you're building something that's relevant to them, that they find interesting, and that they feel they had a role in. So surveys aren't enough. A lot of companies they'll send out a survey. Are you happy with our service? That's very superficial. It can definitely be useful in some cases, but it's not enough. You got to go out there and watch them. And the other advice that I have to you is you want to stay unbiased, which is pretty hard to do, especially I think for a small business. I've had a couple of small businesses in the past, and it's easy to get attached to an idea. And even if you think you're unbiased, sometimes you're not. So if you can take somebody with you who's somewhat objective, who can also watch what's going on and give you their feedback as well, that can be really helpful. So here's a real world example of the benefits that you can get from observation. This is a woman using a Pyrex measuring cup. They work fine, we all have them, it gets the job done. Anybody see a potential problem with this measuring cup? It could break, yeah, possibly. Any other issues? What's that? Small font, yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I didn't think about that, and that's something that was addressed in the next picture I'm going to show you. But OXO is this company that's known for building lots of prototypes of household goods, can openers, measuring cups, things like that, and watching while people use them. And they use all of that feedback to redesign their prototypes until they really get them right. And what they noticed with people using measuring cups is you put the liquid in, and then you have to bend over to check and see if it's at the right level. And if it's not, you add a little more, you bend over again. We all do it and we don't think anything about it. That's just how measuring cups have always worked, right? So if you sent out a survey, or if you called a customer on a phone and said, are you happy with your measuring cup? They say, yeah, you know, it measures everything, gets the job done for me. But OXO noticed that one behavior, and they realized that if we could fix that problem that users don't even know they have, they'd be so much happier with the outcome. So they're the ones who design, I don't know if you guys have seen this measuring cup, but it's got a slanted piece inside. And when you pour the liquid in and you're looking down from above, you see the measurement right there. And it does have a larger font, which is interesting. I hadn't noticed that before. But they solved a problem that people didn't even know they had. And the only possible way they could have done this was by observing their customers. So you never know what you might observe when you go watch them use your product or your service. And that's why it's so important to do it. So if you want to learn more about this, I'm going to provide the slides later, so don't feel like you have to write this stuff down. But Tomer Sharon is a researcher for Google. He's written a book called It's Our Research, where he shares all kinds of different methodologies and approaches you can use if you want to get out in the field and observe your customers and try to learn from them. It's a fantastic book. And then the other thing is the Lean Startup Machine. I checked, it doesn't look like they do any workshops anywhere near here. I think the closest is DC, but if you ever get a chance to go do one of those, I really recommend it. Because what they will do is put you out of your comfort zone. You join a team, and within like half an hour, you're out on the street showing your ideas to people and getting their feedback and figuring out how their feedback is going to factor into your next iteration. And so if you're not comfortable or used to doing research with customers, it's a great way to just get a bunch of hands-on practice. It takes place over the course of a weekend. So if you ever get a chance to do that, I really recommend it. All right, so obviously it's important to know your customers. The next step is to tell their story and tell it in a clear way. And it doesn't matter if you're a huge company or a really small company. This might seem silly if you're a small company, but it is so worth doing. So the first thing you want to create is a persona. And I can't tell you how many businesses I've gone into where I'll ask different stakeholders, who's your customer, who's your user, and I get different answers. They think they agree and they don't. And that always shows up in the end result. It always feels like it's trying to be all things to all people, or it's just kind of a confused solution, and you can almost always trace that back to a lack of a shared understanding of who your user really is. So you want to crystallize some understanding of your primary user into a persona. The simplest kind of persona you can do is just to draw quadrants on a piece of paper or whatever, and then 4 key bits of information about them. On the upper left, you want to put what their name is. You often put a picture just to help this feel a little bit more like a real person that you can provide some services to. The upper right, demographic information. Now, sometimes personas get a bad rap for being kind of like silly or fluffy, and I think that's just because they're often not done well. If you're building, let's say you want to make an app that helps food trucks find festivals they can go to, it doesn't matter how many dogs your persona has. And you'll see that stuff in there a lot. She has 2 dogs and she likes to knit, and it doesn't matter. So you keep it down to the relevant information. If you're building a food delivery service for pets, then yeah, it matters that they have 2 dogs. So just, pay attention to what actually matters about your user. And then on the bottom left, what does she need? On the bottom right, what would make her happy? And those aren't necessarily always the same thing. So in the OXO example, your user needs a measuring cup, but what would make her really happy is if she didn't have to do all these acrobatics to get her milk measured in a jug, right? So that's where the user experience differentiation comes in. You can build a product that checks all the boxes, that does what a person needs, and it still might not be a really delightful experience for them. So if you can figure out not just what they need, but what would make them really happy, then you're definitely on the right track to building something successful. So once you've got your persona, then it's time to move on into scenarios. And I'm going to guess that probably nobody listening to this presentation has done one of these before. And you absolutely should. This is one of my favorite tools for doing user experience work and forming this clear vision and story about what you're trying to accomplish. And a scenario, it's just a narrative. It's just a written story. Depending on the project, it might just be a couple sentences or a paragraph, but it just describes what are we doing for this person? What are they going to be able to accomplish by the time they're done? And what's nice about stories is that you can share them with people. If you write a paragraph and hand it to somebody, they can read it and they can say, oh, this is a really good idea, but did you think about this? They can already start asking really informed questions based on a story. And so you don't have to write a single line of code or design anything to have good conversations about whether or not this idea resonates with people. I've actually used scenarios to validate product ideas with customers before, where they'll read the whole story and they'll say, well, yeah, this sounds good, but I don't think I'd use it because of this. You can really generate a lot of good discussion that way. So I'm going to show you an example of the biggest scenario I ever worked on. And because it's so big, you're not going to be able to read it at all. But this was the $8.5 million project, right? This was where our team decided, we came up with a pretty big vision, that we wanted to help our persona, who happened to be an inner city teenager named Carlos. We wanted to provide a curriculum for him. We had done a lot of research about this persona, and we had validated it with students who were like Carlos. He doesn't have parents at home who can help him get into college. The counselors at these schools are really overloaded and aren't able to help all the kids one-on-one. So we wanted to build a curriculum that would teach Carlos all the things he needs to know to prepare for successful life after high school. Planning a career, applying to college, picking the right colleges is a big vision. And we wanted him to start in 7th grade and potentially use it all the way through college until he came out with a career. So we drew this big vision and we wrote a long scenario which talks about all of the things that happened in Carlos's life related to our software from 7th grade through college. So from the first time he's introduced to it and sits down to start using it, through different adults that help him with different pieces of it along the way, the lessons that he learns, some of the key topics that are covered. It's all in here. And so we were able to, without writing any code, show this to the CEO, show it to our stakeholders, and say, this is what we're building. What do you think? And it's a great way to, again, to get feedback, to get buy-in. I'll zoom in a little so you can see a little bit more detail. We don't always illustrate them because of the huge nature of this project that we decided it was important to do that. All right, so there are a couple resources on personas and scenarios if you want to learn more about these. There's a book by Tamara Adlin called The Essential Persona Life Cycle. And then Kim Goodwin has, I don't believe she's written a book yet, but she has a lot of podcasts and some presentations online about how to effectively use scenarios. Okay, so the last piece I want to talk about is testing early and often. This overlaps a lot with lean startup stuff, but what I'm seeing increasingly is that UX designers or UX strategists are heavily involved in this part of the process too, including me, so I wanted to mention it. The key thing really is just to focus on only building what you really need to build. So there's a tool called story mapping that I think is the absolute most useful tool you can possibly do on any project, especially software projects, but not exclusively. And almost nobody does it, which is really interesting to me because it's so useful. But basically a story map is a visual repository. It's a visual backlog of every idea you have, everything you think you might want to build. And it's a way that you can then start streamlining what do you actually need to build. So without going into too much detail, I'll show you, this is an example, which I'm sure you can't read, but that's okay. That Carlos scenario, we broke it out into those blue cards across the top, and those are the big tasks. So he needs to be able to log in and then do all these lessons and then do some other things. Those are like the epics if you're doing agile development. And underneath each one of those were all of our ideas. You know, maybe he can review his work, maybe he can access all these other tools, all these other ideas that we thought we could build that, but maybe we don't have to right now. And so you'll see these 4 yellow cards are the things that we picked out of that whole backlog that were really essential to building an MVP that we could test. So we had that massive scenario, all of these ideas and implementation details, and we ended up boiling it down to 4 things we had to build to get a prototype in front of students that we could validate to make sure we were heading in the right direction. So story mapping is just really critical. I could spend a whole day doing a story mapping workshop, but if you're interested in that at all, I definitely recommend you check out Jeff Patton's book, User Story Mapping. And then this whole concept of just building an MVP, only building what's necessary, is also covered in the Lean Startup and also the Lean Entrepreneur. So I just want to show you a couple of different ways that we test MVPs, or that you can test an MVP, just to kind of give you a feel for it. One is an A/B test. You probably heard of this one. For some of the things within that curriculum for students, we would build 2 really simple clickable prototypes. We'd go into a classroom, split the kids in half, have each half test 1, and then we would collect their feedback, and then we would use this data to decide which one was more successful, and that would be the one we would use in the finished product. So that's one way to do it. But you really don't have to build anything to test an MVP. You can do like what Dropbox did. Are you guys familiar with how Dropbox handled their MVP? It's a really interesting story. The founder of Dropbox knew he had a good idea, but he didn't have the resources that it would take to build something like Dropbox. That's a huge technical undertaking. So what he did is he simulated it. He made a video that made it look like Dropbox existed. He made all the screens and he animated things, but none of it actually existed. And he just put the video online saying, here's what Dropbox looks like, who wants to sign up? And his beta sign up list went from 5,000 subscribers to 75,000 subscribers overnight. So that's a fantastic and really creative way to validate his idea. He knew at that point, this is worth building, and I can take this, sign up list, I can show my success from the MVP to investors and get funding to get this built. So that's an interesting approach. Another thing that places do is just a landing page. And actually the Lean Startup Machine that I mentioned earlier, they do this. When I was looking to see if they have them in Norfolk, I found there's a Richmond page, but when you go to it, it just says enter your email address to unlock. So obviously, the Lean Startup Machine is They're just collecting data to see when they get enough people interested in Richmond, and then they'll offer one there. So that's another way to do it, just to see if there's enough interest in an idea before you pursue it. And the final one I'm going to show you is called MealSnap. Have you guys heard of this one? It's been around a while, but I don't think it ever really caught on. It's an app where you can take a picture of your meal and submit it, and then it'll respond to you and tell you how many calories are in your meal. And I think this is such an interesting way to do an MVP. What they call this in UX terms is it's a Wizard of Oz test. Because there's a man behind the curtain, but the user doesn't know. It feels like magic if you're a person and you just take a picture and it's like, hey, that's 300 calories. But what actually happens is they use Mechanical Turk. So they have all these workers behind the scenes who receive that picture, study it, figure out what's in it, type, use some kind of calorie counter to type in all the information, and then they get a total and they send it back to you. But it's brilliant because they didn't have to build any of the technology. They could just have people send back the results, and if there was enough adoption of this app, then they could worry about building the technology later. Another thing that's really interesting about this one to me is I actually just read an article this week about Google. They have built now the technology to do this exact same thing. They actually have built all these algorithms and things that will go out, you send in your picture, it'll go out on the internet and find similar pictures and somehow analyze the data from those and send you back an estimate of what the calories are. And I read an interview with the guy, the head engineer, I think, who's on this project, and he said, I just know people really want this. And I thought, that's pretty interesting because MealSnap didn't come to the same conclusion. They've been on the market for 5 years and it never caught on. So that's one of the dangers, I think, of not getting to know your users and not testing an MVP is you can spend all this time and money building actual technology to solve a problem that nobody really cares about. He also said that he estimates it might work about 20 to 30% of the time, which is a terrible user experience. So there's no way that's going to catch on. I wouldn't use an app if it's only right 20% of the time. So I think that just kind of brings us back full circle. Like, you really have to understand your users, know what they want before you spend all your time and money building a solution to a problem that nobody cares about. That's it for me and what UX is and why I think it's important. Did you guys have any questions? No questions. Good, that was easy.
Thank you.
Thanks.